Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the United States and around the world, and I give you expert insights on public health and infectious disease. This is our weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. On these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases, and particularly the outbreaks that you need to know about. And I do this with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jon Epstein, a virologist, veterinarian, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking dangerous infectious diseases across all corners of the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Thanks as always for having me, Jay. How are you this week?
I'm doing pretty well. We're recording this on a Tuesday, and it sounds like you were up last night with a very tense sports event, huh?
Oh my God. Well, now we're going to date this show, and I guess these air pretty quickly. But yes, it was a tough loss for the Celtics last night in the playoffs. And I know people in New York might be watching this going, what an amazing comeback. And it was, but it was tough to swallow with a 20-point lead in the third quarter.
Yeah, both you and I are big basketball fans, and so it was fun talking a little bit about this before we talked. And every time I try to explain to people about different infectious diseases, I like to use sports analogies just because I think, a lot of people are aware about them and understand them. And so you could talk all about, the offense of a microbe and the defense of our immune system and how you adjust and adapt. And so anyway, I love sports because they're fun, but they're also good for the type of work we do, which is communicating complex scientific subjects to people.
That was true. It was as if the Celtics let their guard down and the infectious disease Knicks just came roaring back and took over. And that's exactly what happens in public health all the time.
That's exactly right. And our first topic this week is actually about, if you use the same basketball analogy, it would be like introducing something else onto the court that nobody has ever seen, ever heard of, and doesn't know what the rules are. And those are infectious diseases called prions. And I'm starting out this week with a segment about what's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and can sometimes present as mad cow disease in Oregon. So the Hood River County Health Department recently put out a press release that over the past 8 months, there have been 3 cases, 1 confirmed and 2 probable, of something called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. This is a rare progressive brain disorder that's very similar to mad cow disease. And one of the things that really worries us about these diseases is they are deadly. So of the 3 people that were known to be infected, 2 of them have already died. So Jon, tell me a little bit, what do you know about Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and the types of diseases that are caused by what we call prions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting category of pathogens or infectious agents. We talk a lot about viruses, we talk a lot about bacteria, and these are organisms that we, historically have a better understanding of. But prions are interesting. They're not a living organism. They are a teeny tiny little protein that is misfolded, that is malfunctioning. And when we talk about proteins, a lot of us think about protein as a nutritious, an element of nutrition, right? That we eat protein in our food that helps muscle and all this. Well, in our body, proteins are actually functional. They do things, and they do things based on their conformation or their shape and their structure, and they serve all kinds of functions. Prions are individual proteins that are malformed that can cause disease, and they get into our central nervous system, and that's the whole mad cow or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. They get into our spinal cord and our brain, and they cause things to misfunction, and it causes actually physical damage in our brain. That's this spongiform encephalopathy we talk about, particularly in cows, where it causes these pockets or holes to form in our central nervous system tissue, in our brain tissue, our spinal tissue. And that, of course, has devastating and deadly consequences.
Yeah, I mean, this is one type of protein you do not want in your protein powder, right? And the origins of this are fascinating, right? Like how this was first discovered. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
I know, yeah. So originally in humans, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was discovered. It was called Kuru. This was from cannibals, and I believe it was in Papua New Guinea it was first discovered, but people eating other humans, and particularly central nervous system tissue like brains, would then get exposed to prions if the person that was infected, that was being consumed, and it would then infect the new host. And so it was often, it was a very rare disease, wasn't seen very often, but it was linked to cannibalism. And similarly, in cows, the way we discovered bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, was that our industrialized farming practices a few decades ago, it was very common to feed cows animal feed that included rendered protein from other animals, meaning that they would take sheep or other mammals, grind them up and put it in cow feed as a source of protein, cheap protein. But that also included nervous tissue. It included spinal cord and brain matter. And as cows were eating, animal tissues that included central nervous system tissue and including from cows, occasionally they would develop prion disease as well. And sheep can get it too. Sheep can get a prion disease called scrapie, which is similarly from eating tissue from other sheep. So it's this theme of cannibalism that exists both in humans and animals that can lead to prion disease.
Yeah. And so let me just give a little bit of background for people, just so we can, we've touched on a couple of these topics. So this disease that 3 people in Oregon have gotten, 2 of them have already died from, is incredibly dangerous and deadly. And one of the things that really is so difficult about it is we just don't know how a lot of people get infected. So what happens is people somehow get exposed to this prion, this strange misfolded protein. We know it can be transmitted by different types of foods, as you mentioned, mad cow or eating certain types of contaminated meat might be a cause. The second is if something had done surgery or a procedure on a brain, and then that instrument hasn't been thoroughly cleaned, it can actually cause this same disease, essentially directly introducing it to the brain. But there are a whole host of reasons why people get infected that we never are able to figure out what happens. And then after this prion enters your body and enters your brain, we also don't know how it gets to your brain. It essentially eats away the tissue in the brain. And we call it a spongiform encephalopathy because literally the brain ends up having holes in it so that if you look at it after the person has died and you look at their brain, it basically looks like a sponge. And the disease is slowly developing. We believe that from the time to exposure to the time you get disease, it can be months or even years until you start to get that disease. You start to demonstrate basically symptoms like you're losing your mind, as you might if you maybe had, a severe form of dementia like Alzheimer's or Huntington's disease. You get changes in your memory, in your walking, your coordination, your speech, your behavior. And it's a really horrific disease because you essentially die without there being any treatment whatsoever available. Now, the good news is that it's extremely rare, right? There's only about 1 person in a million, if you look across the world, that ever gets diagnosed by it. But like a lot of rare events that have really bad consequences, like 100% fatal, it is something that we worry about.
That's right. And it's important to mention too, Jay, that while it is rare and while we don't always know how people get infected, we are aware of other instances of prion disease in the animal world. And so I also wanted to bring up the fact that in the past, about 20 years ago, prion disease was discovered in deer, in white-tailed deer, and we call this chronic wasting disease. It was noticed that deer around North America were starting to present as emaciated, uncoordinated. They were showing neurological signs, and it was discovered that they too suffer from a prion disease. And we call it chronic wasting disease because of that presentation of weight loss and emaciation. And deer can give it to each other through contact with bodily fluids or even from environmental contamination. We don't entirely know how frequently it's transmitted, but we do see this throughout the deer population in the United States and parts of Canada.
Yeah. And, and again, this is a very rare disease that we're talking about both in animals and in humans. But I remember something very, striking and sad that happened during my career at CDC. There was an epidemiologist named Stephen Thacker who was kind of a legend at CDC from the 1970s through the time I did my training in the 2000s. He was one of the sort of leading disease detectives that CDC had, and he eventually went on to run basically CDC's training programs, the program that trains people like myself to learn how to be disease detectives. So an entire generation of CDC people kind of owe a lot of their training to this man named Stephen Thacker. And Stephen unfortunately died in February of 2013 at the age of 65. And, this is a guy that figured out basically discovered Legionnaire's disease. There was an outbreak in 1976 at a convention in Philadelphia. He was the lead disease detective. And sure enough, Stephen died of rare infectious diseases. I mean, it's one of these sort of weird, bitter ironies that a famous disease detective dies from an unusual disease. And it's believed that sometime in the 1970s, before he joined CDC, he had spent time in England as a student. and might very well have been exposed to contaminated beef, basically mad cow disease or bovine spongiform
Yeah.
encephalopathy, mad cow disease. And that was the theory on why now 30 something years after that, 30 plus years after that, he developed this very unusual and severe and deadly disease.
Yeah. And it's important to mention, while we're talking about this, that since the discovery of BSE, we have changed our rules and guidelines and policies about how cows are fed, how animals are fed on farms. And they are no longer fed other animal protein to ensure that we're not propagating prion disease, in our livestock. So this is something now that people in the UK and the US, Canada are all very aware of and take great measures to prevent.
Yeah. So I think sort of, important takeaways for people. I think one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this story is because it's a important example of how little we still understand all the different ways that these microbes out there, bacteria, viruses, parasites, but even prions, can make us sick or impact us in some way. And the more we learn about chronic diseases, whether it's multiple sclerosis or Alzheimer's, we're discovering a connection to the microbial world. And so this is just another example of the ways in which we interact with things and still are learning about them as well.
Yeah, great to bring it up and good to talk and remind us about these diseases that affect both people and animals and that are, in our environment.
Yeah, and so let's talk about another disease that is transmitted in the environment. A friend of mine recently was asking me an infectious disease question. They have a coworker who is originally from Colombia and Latin America and was planning to go back, but they, recovering from cancer therapy, and they were afraid about an outbreak that's occurring in Colombia right now, including in big cities like Medellin and Bogota. And they asked me some questions, and I was like, wait a second, are you talking about yellow fever? And sure enough, the CDC has issued a level 2 travel notice, what's called practice enhanced precautions, about a disease called yellow fever in South America due to an increase in cases and a spread to areas that haven't really reported yellow fever in a very long time. This includes Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. And this travel alert urges travelers, anybody traveling to regions of South America, including Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru, to get a yellow fever vaccine at least 10 days before they leave the United States. And it says that anybody who was vaccinated more than 10 years ago may need to get a booster dose. So, Jon, what's going on with yellow fever in the Western Hemisphere?
This is something we traditionally thought about as something prevalent in Africa. And oftentimes to get into African countries as a tourist, you have to show proof of vaccination against yellow fever. So it isn't per se new that it's circulating in South America and in the Americas, but it is probably increasing. And that's a product of environmental change that's promoting the prevalence of a certain type of mosquito that tends to spread it. And these are Aedes mosquitoes. And so it may be that there's a boom of these types of mosquitoes. They tend to live around people and in urban environments. And so that could cause increased transmission. And there's also a sylvatic cycle that we don't know as much about, where there are animals that host yellow fever viruses where mosquitoes bite those wild animals and then may bite humans. And so because of the environmental change, particularly in areas of South America, like around the Amazon rainforest, there could be changes in the ecology of mosquitoes that are causing increased transmission.
Yeah, and I think you and I are both people that have a yellow fever vaccine, because when we travel throughout the African continent, as you mentioned, you're often required to show proof of vaccination. And this is why, like during COVID, when people seemed so shocked by the idea that you might need a vaccine to do certain activities or to travel, I'd always have to point out to people, hey, we already have vaccine requirements in many parts of the world, particularly for diseases like this, like yellow fever. And the US has an interesting history with yellow fever too. I mean, if you go back to the time of the revolution, right?
Right, right. Yeah, talk about it. I mean, originally it was Washington, D.C., right? It was literally a swamp. And I think yellow fever and other mosquito-borne diseases were more prevalent back in the early days of our settlement because of the environment that promoted mosquitoes and transmission. Isn't that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, DC is a perfect example. And one of the most famous outbreaks of yellow fever in the United States history was a little bit north of DC, was in Philadelphia in 1793, where there was a devastating yellow fever epidemic that killed about 5,000 people, which was almost 10% of the city's population. So just imagine that 1 in 10 people died in Philadelphia in 1793 because of a disease transmitted by mosquitoes that can make people severely ill. That can cause them to get jaundice, to turn yellow, essentially, which is why it's called yellow fever. And people basically like fled the city, including a lot of government officials. And it was one of the first examples, in the new country of the United States, where it became very clear that there need to be very strong public health programs to help protect people against these diseases. And so when a lot of times when people, I reflect back on COVID and other things, and they say, well, public health has gotten out of control, this is un-American, I try to remind people that Ben Franklin in 1793 and every leader of the early revolution, of the U.S. Revolution, signers to the Declaration of Independence, was deeply concerned about public health and felt it was an intrinsic government responsibility because they had experiences like this about yellow fever epidemics in 1793, as well as smallpox epidemics among their troops. So this is a disease that we definitely do not want to see recur in the Americas, because it could eventually come here because of climate change and the spread of these mosquitoes. And it spreads because when humans get the infection and then move to a new area, if the mosquito is there, it can bite you and then transmit it to somebody else.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before on the show, that with climate change, we're going to see increased prevalence of different mosquitoes, particularly in the southern United States. And we're already starting to see transmission of viruses and pathogens, including malaria, that are traditionally thought of as tropical diseases, but really around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, we're starting to see more and more transmission. And we, scientists really expect that as temperatures warm on average, environments moving more northward in the United States will be suitable for the types of mosquitoes that can transmit these diseases. So it's important to keep talking about these, to keep monitoring for them. And, people should really be reminded that, mosquitoes aren't just annoying because they give you bites that itch, but it's possible they carry diseases that can really impact your health.
Yeah. And so I think the important lesson for viewers out there to keep in mind is that, always practice good mosquito prevention during the summer months, and particularly if you're traveling to areas where there's a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. So that includes wearing long sleeve clothes. It can be thin and light, obviously, using good mosquito repellents and protection, particularly during like morning and evenings, dusk and dawn. And also getting vaccinated against disease you can get vaccinated for. So if you're going to travel to a lot of these amazing areas in Latin America, make sure you consider getting vaccinated for yellow fever.
And Jay, I think it's a perfect segue into our next topic. The other, perpetrator of vector-borne disease besides mosquitoes are ticks. And this is a little closer to home, but there was a recent story about the increased prevalence of ticks and tick-borne diseases we should expect this spring and summer here in New York City. Isn't that right?
Yeah. So, there's been, a warning that's been put out by the New York City Health Department and the New York State Health Department, warning New York City residents about a tremendous surge in tick numbers this year. And, there's a lot of oak trees in New York City. And it turns out, because we have so many oak trees, and trees are a good thing, but with more than 130,000 oak trees in New York City, it also means that there's been an increase in the number of black-legged ticks. And one of the reasons we worry about ticks is because they carry diseases like Lyme disease, which is an unusual bacterial infection. They also carry viruses, and they also carry parasites. So kind of all the major, classes of microbes that we worry about, maybe except prions, can be caused by ticks. So John, tell me a little bit, why is the tick population booming? What does it have to do with trees and animals?
Yeah. So we can't look at anything in a vacuum. And this is really the essence of talking about the ecology of infectious diseases. It isn't just that ticks are more prevalent, but when we think about things like Lyme disease, the spirochete, or the bacteria that causes the disease, is carried by a mouse called the white-footed mouse. And mice, we all know mice are pretty good at breeding and making lots more mice, but mouse populations really boom and bust depending on food resource availability. So how this ties into oak trees in New York City is that every couple of years, oak trees go into a mast season where they produce an extra amount of acorns. They're really robust, and they shed those acorns. Those acorns are food for mice. And so when there's huge production of acorns, particularly in city parks, mice do really well and the population booms. This is really good for ticks, black-legged ticks that love to feed on mice. And then in following years, subsequent years, like we're a few years after a big boom of acorns, the mouse population recedes a little bit, but the ticks are still around and they're hungry. So when they don't have mice to feed on, they look for other hosts, which can often be people.
Yeah. So feeding on people, that's the risk, right? Because when they try to take when they essentially are feeding on people, in addition to sucking blood out, they're also introducing things into the human bloodstream, and those include all these different types of infections.
That's right. And so ticks go through a life cycle that allows them to survive through the winter. And then they go into a stage called the nymph stage, which is an intermediate life stage. They're really tiny, about the size of a poppy seed, but that's when they're still able to transmit disease and bite people. And they're really hard to see. So going back to our, personal, what can we do to prevent getting exposed to diseases? Mosquito prevention is much like tick prevention, making sure that when we're hiking through the woods or hanging out in a field, particularly with long grass, or we're in a park, let's wear longer clothing. That's not always fun in the summer and springtime, but it's a good way to prevent getting bitten. Wearing repellent, lots of good bug sprays that have DEET in them, particularly those that are 40% or greater, can be effective at repelling ticks and mosquitoes, and that can keep us safe. So get that sprayed onto your body, and treated clothing as well with insect repellent. Those are 3 things you can do to protect yourself. And the 4th is really stay vigilant about checking your body for ticks when you come back from a day out in the woods or walking through fields or hanging out in the park. Just give yourself a quick little check between your toes, feet, and ankles. Have someone look on your back and under your hairline. This is where we often miss ticks when they're biting us. And that's a great way to be sure that you're not getting exposed to some of these tick-borne diseases.
Yeah, I mean, I remember as a kid growing up in New Jersey that my, mom would check my hair and check my body for
Yeah.
ticks. And I'm sure, where you live in the suburbs, right? I'm sure you have to do this with your kids as well, right?
We have tons of woods. I encourage my kids to get out into the woods and play and explore. I love it. And I go in too, but I am always thinking about ticks and mosquitoes. And so we're just careful to check ourselves. And it's not a problem if you take some precautions.
Yep, absolutely. And on this note, thank you very much for joining me this week, John, and thank you to everybody out there watching right now. If you are interested in infectious diseases and public health, and you also want to get the message out to your friends, your colleagues, people in your life, please hit the like button. Please hit subscribe and share this episode. And we'll see you back next week for another episode of Inside Outbreaks here on Thermometer.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Be well.